On December 19, 1899, 400 guests filed through the front doors of a mansion that should not have existed. Not because the architecture was impossible, though it nearly was. 110 rooms, 55 bedrooms, a ballroom that could hold 1,000 people, an art gallery housing paintings by Raphael, Rembrandt, and Vermeer. An entire wing designed around a collection that would one day be valued at billions. The whole thing was built from Indiana limestone, measured 325 feet across, and sat on nearly 500 acres of manicured Pennsylvania countryside. It took just 2 years to build. The man who built it was the son of a butcher. That night, the New York Symphony played, while the soprano Johanna Gadsky sang for Philadelphia's wealthiest families. Crystal glasses clinked under electric chandeliers, which was still a novelty in 1899. The host, Peter Errol Brown Widener, moved through his creation with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had built exactly what he wanted. A home large enough for his sons, their families, and the art collection that had become his greatest obsession. He called it Lynnewood Hall. His grandson would later call it the last American Versailles. Both names fit. But here's what nobody at that party could have known. Within 13 years, 2 of the people in that ballroom would be dead at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Within 40 years, every painting on those walls would be gone. Within 60, strangers would be ripping the fixtures from the walls and selling them for scrap. And within a century, this place, this impossible palace built by a butcher's son, would sit empty and silent, its 110 rooms holding nothing but dust and the memory of what used to be. This is the story of how one family's grief, one ocean liner, and one man's stubborn love of art created the most heartbreaking ruin in America. Peter Widener was born in 1834 in the Whiteland Hills neighborhood of Philadelphia to parents who had immigrated from Germany. His father was a butcher, and young Peter followed him into the trade, apprenticing in the business as a teenager before opening his own stall in a local market. That stall became more than just a place to sell meat. It became a social hub, the gathering point for the neighborhood's political conversations and debates. Widener had a talent for making connections, and by his 20s, he had been elected Republican leader of Philadelphia's 20th Ward. Politics led to business. When the Civil War broke out, Widener won a contract to supply mutton to the entire Union Army. The profits were enormous, and Widener invested every dollar he could into the emerging streetcar industry. He partnered with William Elkins, and together they built the Philadelphia Traction Company, which constructed public transit systems across Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago. The money multiplied. Widener took stakes in U.S. Steel, the American Tobacco Company, and Standard Oil. By the 1880s, he was one of the wealthiest men in America. But wealth alone never satisfied Peter Widener. Around 1885, he began collecting art. Not as decoration for his walls, not as a status symbol to impress his peers, but as a genuine passion that consumed him. He studied the old masters with the discipline of a scholar. He traveled to Europe repeatedly, buying directly from private collections and auction houses that catered to royalty. He acquired works by Raphael, Rembrandt, Vermeer, Van Dyck, El Greco, Gainsborough, Reynolds, Donatello, and Bellini. His taste was exquisite, and his wallet was bottomless. At one point, he owned more Rembrandts than any private collector in the world outside of Buckingham Palace. Within a decade, he had assembled one of the finest private art collections in the Western Hemisphere. The collection needed a proper home, and so did his grieving family. In 1896, Widener's wife Hannah died aboard the family's yacht off the coast of Maine. The grief was crushing. Widener couldn't bear to remain in their Philadelphia townhouse, surrounded by her memory in every room, that he wanted a fresh start. He wanted his sons, George and Joseph, and their families living under one roof where he could keep them close. He wanted a building truly worthy of the art he had spent his life collecting. He turned to Horace Trumbauer. The architect was only 29 years old, but he had already designed homes for several of Philadelphia's wealthiest families, and Widener recognized his talent immediately. Trumbauer drew inspiration from Prior Park, saw an English country mansion in Bath, and modeled elements of the facade after the White House itself. The result was Lynnewood Hall. Construction began in 1897. The scale was staggering. The mansion measured 325 feet long by 215 feet deep. Its longest interior corridor, the enfilade running from the east wing to the west, stretched 268 feet without interruption. That is the longest residential corridor in any home in America, and before or since. The interior was designed by the French firm Carlian et Fils, who filled the rooms with salvaged European furniture, tapestries, and architectural elements. The ballroom featured furniture imported from Italy. The dining room was paneled in French walnut and decorated with Gobelin tapestries. One of the ceilings was a mural by Giovanni Battista Tiepolo, salvaged from an Italian palazzo. The house had its own electrical power plant, an indoor swimming pool, wine cellars, a bakery, carpentry, and upholstery studios, and 33 acres of formal gardens designed by head gardener William Kleinheinz. The first floor held a reception room dripping with gold leaf, a smoking room, a billiard room, and the first of 5 art galleries. The second floor was almost entirely dedicated to displaying Widener's collection, with 4 additional galleries, each designed to showcase specific artists and styles. Widener arranged his Rembrandts together. His Italian masters had their own room. Every painting was lit by the most advanced gallery lighting technology available, because Widener insisted that his art be seen the way the artists intended. Running this palace required 37 permanent domestic staff and another 60 workers for the grounds and gardens. And yet, despite the enormity of the place, visitors who came to Lynnewood Hall often remarked that it felt refined rather than overwhelming. Trumbauer had designed something rare, a home that was simultaneously massive and intimate, a place where you could get lost in a corridor or find yourself alone in a quiet reading room, surrounded by masterpieces that ordinary visitors would never see outside a museum. For the first decade of the 20th century, Lynnewood Hall was the center of Philadelphia society. The Wideners hosted legendary gatherings. Peter's eldest son, George, married Eleanor Elkins, the daughter of William Elkins, binding 2 of the city's wealthiest families together. The grandchildren grew up running through those 110 rooms. Peter's grandson, Harry Elkins Widener, developed his own passion, not for paintings, but for rare books. He assembled a collection of 3,000 volumes that he kept in the library at Lynnewood Hall, a room lined with low bookcases beneath paintings and a Tiepolo ceiling. It was a golden age. The family was together. The art was magnificent. The house was alive. And then came April 1912. George Widener, his wife Eleanor, and their son Harry had traveled to Europe that spring. Harry, who was 27, had been hunting for rare books in London. He reportedly acquired a 1598 edition of Francis Bacon's essays during the trip, a prize he was eager to bring home. For the return voyage, George booked first-class passages on the newest, largest, and most celebrated ocean liner in the world. On the evening of April 14, 1912, George hosted an elaborate dinner party in the first-class dining saloon aboard the ship. It was a lavish affair, attended by some of the wealthiest passengers on board. The captain, Edward John Smith, attended the dinner, but excused himself early from the table. There were reports of icebergs in the ship's path, and he needed to return to the bridge. What happened next has been told 1,000 times, but it never stops being terrible. At 11:40 that night, the ship struck an iceberg in the freezing North Atlantic. George Widener, his valet Edwin Keeping, and Harry Elkins Widener all went down with the Titanic. Eleanor and her maid survived by boarding a lifeboat reserved for first-class women. The news reached Lynnewood Hall within days. Peter Widener, now 77 years old, had lost his eldest son and his beloved grandson in a single night. The library where Harry had kept his rare books became unbearable to enter. Widener eventually had it converted into a second ballroom. He could not look at the shelves without seeing his grandson. Peter Widener spent his final 3 years at Lynnewood Hall as a man hollowed out by grief. His health had already been declining before the Titanic, but the disaster broke something inside him that never healed. He wandered the corridors of his 110-room mansion, past the Rembrandts and the Raphaels, out past the empty chairs in the ballroom, where his son and grandson would never sit again. Friends who visited reported that Widener had aged decades in a matter of months. The vitality that had carried him from a butcher's stall to the heights of American industry was gone. On November 6, 1915, Peter Errol Brown Widener died in his bed at Lynnewood Hall. He was 80 years old. The New York Times reported that the cause was old age, compounded by deep sorrow over the loss of his son and grandson aboard the Titanic. The butcher's son, who built a palace of art, died in its quiet rooms, surrounded by Rembrandts and ghosts. Everything Peter Widener had built now fell to his surviving son, Joseph. The younger Widener inherited a fortune estimated at $60 million, which in today's money would be close to $2 billion. So he also inherited Lynnewood Hall and the art collection inside it. Joseph was a different man than his father. Where Peter had been a relentless empire builder, Joseph was quieter, more refined. He loved horses and horse racing. He bred thoroughbreds and won the Belmont Stakes. But he also shared his father's deep love of art, and he took the stewardship of the collection seriously. Between 1915 and 1940, Joseph continued to add to the family's holdings, acquiring new pieces and refining what was already there. He opened the Lynnewood Hall galleries to the public by appointment between June and October each year. For 25 years, anyone who made arrangements could walk through the private galleries of this enormous mansion and stand face to face with Raphael's Small Cowper Madonna, Bellini's Feast of the Gods, 14 Rembrandts, 2 Vermeers, and dozens of works by Van Dyck, Gainsborough, and Reynolds. But Joseph also understood something his father perhaps never fully accepted. The era of the great private mansion was ending. The costs of maintaining a 110-room estate were staggering, and the tax burden on properties like Lynnewood Hall was growing heavier every decade. In 1940, Joseph's own son, Peter A.B. Widener II, wrote in his autobiography that the days of America's privately owned treasure houses were over. He called Lynnewood Hall the last American Versailles, and he meant it as both tribute and eulogy. In 1942, Joseph Widener made one of the largest charitable donations in American history. He gave more than 2,000 sculptures, paintings, decorative artworks, and porcelains from the Lynnewood Hall collection to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. The donation included Raphael's Small Cowper Madonna, Bellini's Feast of the Gods, 8 Van Dycks, 2 Vermeers, and 14 Rembrandts. Peter Widener had originally wanted the collection to go to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, but Joseph chose Washington instead. The reasons were complicated, involving disputes with the city of Philadelphia and a desire to keep the collection unified under one roof at the National Gallery, where it remains today. If you visit the National Gallery and walk through its European Masterpieces wing, you are looking at the walls of Lynnewood Hall. Not literally, but spiritually. Those paintings hung in the galleries of that mansion for decades before they hung in Washington. With the art gone, Lynnewood Hall lost its purpose. The Widener family began selling off portions of the original estate. The 480-acre property was carved up throughout the 1940s. What had once been rolling countryside became suburban development. The mansion itself, still standing on its reduced 33 acres, became an expensive problem with no clear solution. In 1952, Lynnewood Hall was sold to its first new owner since the Widener family. The price was $192,000. To put that in perspective, the mansion had cost $8 million to build in 1899, the equivalent of roughly $250 million today. It sold for less than the cost of a modest house. The buyer was Faith Theological Seminary, a small Christian institution led by a radio preacher named Carl McIntyre. The seminary moved its operations into Lynnewood Hall and began training ministers and Christian leaders within its walls. For over 40 years, the building served as a functioning school. Students slept in rooms that had once housed Widener family guests. They studied theology in the grand spaces where Rembrandts once hung. There is something almost poetic about a butcher's son's palace becoming a school for preachers. Peter Widener might have appreciated the irony, but the seminary years were also the years when Lynnewood Hall began to die from the inside. McIntyre's institution was never wealthy, and as financial troubles mounted through the 1970s and 1980s, the seminary began doing something unforgivable to preservationists. They started dismantling the interior of one of America's greatest homes and selling it off piece by piece. Marble fireplaces were pulled from the walls and auctioned. Decorative fixtures, bronze hardware, crystal chandeliers, architectural details, anything that could be removed and converted to cash, was stripped from the building. The French walnut paneling in the dining room, the gilded moldings, the salvaged European furniture that Carlian Fils had installed in 1899, piece by piece, it all disappeared. Every sale kept the seminary operating for another month or another semester, but each one also erased a little more of what Lynnewood Hall had been. By the mid-1990s, the seminary was in deep financial trouble. In 1996, the property was sold again in a sheriff's sale to the First Korean Church of New York, a Presbyterian-affiliated congregation with ties to the seminary. The purchase price was modest, but the new owners inherited a building that was already in serious distress. The church attempted multiple times to obtain zoning approval to use the property as a seminary and place of worship, but every application was denied by the local authorities. And for years, the congregation fought legal battles over tax exemptions, with courts eventually ruling in 2006 that the property had not been demonstrably used for religious or educational purposes since 1998. The building sat in legal limbo. Nobody was maintaining it. Nobody was heating it. Nobody was stopping the rain from coming through the roof. The same slow violence that kills all abandoned buildings began its relentless work on Lynnewood Hall. Water seeped through cracks in the roof and ran down the interior walls, staining the plaster and warping what remained of the woodwork. Paint peeled in long, curling strips from ceilings that had once been gilded with real gold. Plaster crumbled and fell in heavy chunks, exposing the wooden lath beneath. The indoor swimming pool sat dry and cracked, its tile work covered in debris. The ballroom, where 1,000 guests had once danced beneath Italian furniture, was empty and cold. Its floor buckled, its walls stained with moisture. The 33 acres of formal gardens, once considered among the finest residential French gardens in the United States, grew wild and overgrown. Throughout these years, the church continued to sell off whatever remained inside the building. In 2006, Lynnewood Hall's ornamental fountain, designed by the French landscape architect Jacques Graber, was sold at auction. Each sale was a small death, so another piece of the mansion's identity ripped away and scattered to the winds. By 2012, after a final court ruling denied the church's tax exemption, the property's pastor, Dr. Richard Yoon, gave an interview saying he intended to relocate the church and end the fight. The mansion went on the market for $11 million. Despite multiple offers above asking price, the property remained unsold for years. So a historical restoration architect estimated in 2014 that it would cost at least $50 million to restore Lynnewood Hall to anything resembling its original condition. And then, just when it seemed like the last American Versailles might follow the path of its sister mansion, Whitemarsh Hall, which had been demolished just 5 miles away, something unexpected happened. In 2022, the Lynnewood Hall Preservation Foundation was established with a single mission: save this building. In February 2023, a purchase agreement was announced. In June 2023, the sale was finalized for $9 million, funded by private donors who believe that this mansion, this relic of ambition and grief and extraordinary art, was worth saving. The foundation's plan is enormous. They estimate the full restoration will cost $100 million and take at least 25 years. The 33 acres of gardens will be restored and opened to the public as a park. The art galleries, long stripped of their masterpieces, will be reimagined as exhibition spaces. The mansion itself will become a cultural center for education, architecture, and the arts. The foundation has already raised more than $9 million and has begun stabilization work to stop the building's further decline. Walking through Lynnewood Hall today is an experience that stays with you. The corridors are vast and silent. The rooms are empty, but the bones of the building are still extraordinary. An Indiana limestone does not rot the way wood does. The structure Trumbauer built was designed to endure, and it has, despite everything that a century of grief and neglect and legal battles threw at it. You can still see the gold leaf in the reception room, faded, but present. You can still trace the outlines of where the Rembrandts hung. You can stand in the ballroom and imagine, if you try, what it sounded like on that December night in 1899, when the New York Symphony played, and 400 guests raised their glasses to Peter Widener's Impossible Dream. The story of Lynnewood Hall is not really about a building. It is about what happens when the people who love a place are taken away from it. Peter Widener built it from grief. The Titanic took his heirs. Time took the art. Neglect took the rest. But the walls are still standing. And for the first time in decades, someone is trying to bring them back to life. If that is not a story worth telling, nothing is. If you made it this far, hit subscribe. I cover stories like this every week. Places where history and loss and beauty collide in ways you don't expect. Share this with someone who loves old buildings or forgotten history. And stick around, because there are more stories coming that you will not want to miss.